Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. That's Proverbs 3, 5-6. So today, we're going to talk about the subject of trust, especially about what happens when doubt goes bad and breaks our ability to trust. You see, trust is what holds the whole world of relationships together. I mean, this is reflected in our language all the time. You know, escrow refers to property that is held in trust. Universities or organizations, they have boards of trustees, people to whom the well-being of the community is entrusted. Some of you parents have set aside money for your children in trust funds. And now your children are trusting that you will die on time so that they can get your money, right? Now, at its core, faith puts trust in a person. And whenever you trust someone, you take a bit of a risk. I mean, it may be a small risk or a big risk. Like I go to a restaurant that you recommend because you told me that the food there is good. Or I read a book because you tell me it's good. I tell you a secret and then I see if you keep it confidential. Or I invite you to be a partner in a business deal. Are you going to burn me? Are you going to betray me? I ask you to be my friend. Okay, that's another one. Are you going to be loyal, or will you turn and no longer be my friend one day? You know, when I trust you, I take a little piece of myself, my money, my time, my heart, and I put it in your hands. And then I'm vulnerable. And when you respond, I find out whether or not you are trustworthy. Like I give you the gift of my trust and you give me the gift of your faithfulness. And as that happens, trust deepens. And folks, there can be no intimacy, no real relationship without trust. You know, let's say someone asks me, Bryan, is your wife Wendy faithful to you? And I say, well, yeah. And so they ask, but how do you know? And I say, because I know my wife. And they might say, but she could be fooling you. I mean, wouldn't you like to know for sure? Like, what do you say we remove all uncertainty? Let's create a Wendy cam and keep her under surveillance 24 hours a day. Wouldn't you want that? Well, my response would be, no way. You know, a while back, I read about this engineer who had a young daughter, and he designed his entire house so that they can have cameras on that little girl at all times. Like every room, every spot she could crawl around to, they can monitor her. Now, as she grows up, she'll probably have a daughter cam installed on that girl that runs 24 hours a day. Like, I wouldn't want to be his daughter. And more than that, I wouldn't want to date his daughter. And I wouldn't want a Wendy cam either, even if I could have one. I wouldn't want to know because I would rather trust. Because when you trust someone, you give him or her a gift, and you enter into a kind of dance. I mean, when I trust, I risk, and I'm vulnerable. And then if you're faithful, then we go to a deeper level of intimacy. See, there's no other way to forge intimacy and depth of relationship between two people than to trust. I mean, that's part of being a human being as opposed to being a robot. Now, in the whole world of objects and machines, we try to remove all uncertainty. Like we want control and predictability. But that can't be done with people. You know, there's an old movie called The Stepford Wives. You may be familiar with it. You know, I heard the remake was not that great. But in the original movie, there's a community called Stepford, where robots who look exactly like all the wives have replaced the wives. And so there's no uncertainty. There's no need for risk or trust. But guys, would you want a woman, if you could have one, who always dressed up for you, always fixed the exact food you wanted, always cleaned up after you, always agreed with whatever you said, always devoted herself to your pleasure at the expense of her own free will? Would you want that? Some of you are still thinking deeply about that. Well, the correct response here would be no. No. You know, that movie is a nightmare, okay? Stepford is a nightmare community. Why? Because freedom and trust is the only way that loving people can have a real relationship with each other. Like, trust is the only way to honor the freedom, the dominion, the dignity of a person. And that's the way the dance works. There's trust and risk, then vulnerability, and then faithfulness, and then intimacy. But that means that sometimes we get hurt. Like, you ask someone for a date and get turned down. That hurts. You start a relationship and get dumped. That hurts. You get your hopes up and get rejected. That hurts. And when that happens, our capacity to trust can be a bit damaged. And we're left with doubts and uncertainties. And these experiences that damage our ability to trust people can damage our ability to trust God as well. You know, a few episodes ago, I talked about how working through our doubts is a normal and healthy process. But there are ways we can respond to our doubts that are not helpful, that do not lead us to more clarity, to more confidence. There are ways that lead us into darker, more destructive ways of thinking. And so we need to ask the question, what does it look like when doubt goes bad, when doubt gets the best of us? Now, to answer this question, let's go back to the very beginning and look at the story of creation and the fall back in Genesis chapter 2. You know, as I mentioned earlier, human beings were created and designed for relationships. And all relationships are built on trust. I mean, God could have created robots that are programmed to do his every bidding, but that would have been rather boring. And so he created us as individuals with a will of our own in hopes that we would exercise our freedom and choice in order to trust in him. And look at what God says about this in Genesis 2:16-17. He says, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will certainly die." In other words, not every choice is good for you. Not every choice is for your benefit. God said, you're free to choose, but you're going to have to risk trusting me for that which will lead to life. Now, here's something interesting to chew on. Even in that perfect world, even before sin, there were uncertainties. There were uncertainties. You know, Adam and Eve faced choices, and they faced uncertainties. Will I be loved? Will God provide? Will life turn out the way I had hoped? And then the serpent comes along, and he preys on these questions. He preys on these very doubts. He asks, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? That's Genesis 3:1. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree? Well, of course, God didn't say that. But notice that the tactic is not to make sin look good. The tactic is to make God look stingy. Let me give you a little caveat here. The devil has only one lie, and that is to cast critical doubt on God's character. And even though we know that they chose to trust the serpent and fell into doubt about God's character, it's important to recognize that they had the option to turn to God here. It's like the missing piece of the story. They could have turned to him and said, God, we're trying to understand the situation here. The issue with this one tree, we're trying to understand why there's a snake talking to us. I mean, what's that all about? We're trying to figure this out. But until we hear from you, we'll trust you enough to stick to what you said. We will trust and obey. Kind of reminds me of that simple and yet powerful little praise tune. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey. Like, obedience would have worked in that instance. But as you know, instead of moving towards God and risking their lives into his hands in faith and trust, they move away from God in fear and self-reliance. And what do they find? Well, they find that their whole world falls apart. They find guilt and shame and loneliness and fear. And what's even worse, they find in this place even more doubt. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? They move away in fear and doubt only to discover more fear and more doubt. And that happens to people today all the time. And so this week and next, I want to address three general categories of doubt gone bad. Three different ways we move away from God instead of toward Him. Now keep in mind, this is not about doubt in general. All right? These three categories are about doubt gone bad. And the first one is what might be called skepticism. Skepticism. Now, the skeptic is someone who says, I'm going to suspend judgment. I'm not going to commit myself because the demand for sufficient evidence has not yet been met. You know, it may sound objective or rational, but the dynamic that's going on beneath the surface in the skeptic is this. I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to look like I'm one of the gullible ones. See, underneath the surface of the skeptic is fear. A fear of being disappointed. And so the skeptic says, I would rather stand on the sidelines and look like an intelligent observer than risk trusting. I will forego all that might come with that trust. You know, our biblical example for skepticism is the disciple who was known for his doubts, doubting Thomas. We see him 3 times in the Gospel of John, and each time he's expressing some sort of skepticism. The climactic incident occurs after the resurrection when Jesus appears to the other disciples who were gathered together. Now think about that. All the disciples were there except Thomas. And they're overjoyed and can't wait to tell Thomas what they just experienced. Now, it's interesting that the text doesn't tell us why Thomas wasn't with them. Is he distancing himself from them? We don't know. But they can't wait to tell him. And so they come to Thomas and say, Thomas, we saw him. Like he's alive. He's risen from the dead. And they had to be stunned by Thomas's response. Yeah, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. What Thomas is saying to them is that they're either lying or they're delusional. Now, he knows better. I mean, Thomas knows them. He knows Jesus. He's heard him teach. He's heard him and seen him just perform miracles for people. And more than any other human being, Thomas, he had good reason to believe. But he chose the skeptic path. And he gave this striking response in John 20:25. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Skeptics do this. They set a demand for certainty at a level that they know cannot be obtained. And it looks rational on the outside, but underneath is the thought, I'm afraid of being wrong. I'm afraid of being hurt or disappointed. Now, the danger of skepticism is that good skeptics can be so invested in wanting to win arguments and appear to be smarter that they'll never find out that God is trustworthy because they'll never risk trusting. But there is hope for skeptics. I mean, at least Thomas is an honest skeptic. And so Jesus comes to him, as he often does for skeptical folks, and meets his outrageous demands. Like, go ahead, Thomas. Like, put your finger in my hand and my side. And in that moment, Thomas is overwhelmed and convicted as his doubt vanishes. So skepticism is the first way that doubt can go bad. But there are other ways that are more dangerous than skepticism. But since we're out of time this week, we'll pick up our discussion on doubt gone bad next week on Tipping Sacred Cows.